It's Leslie Meredith from Breakbulk Events and Media, and I am delighted to welcome Thomas Poulsen, who is the managing partner for Panticon. He recently did an exceptional white paper for us around the wind sector throughout Europe. And that has been, a real eye-opener. And we have gone back to Thomas to see if he can, and I know he can, give us some insight on this sector in a different part of the world, in the Americas. We're on the run-up to Breakbulk Americas, the digital special, and we will be featuring a session on offshore wind. So we are going to rely on Thomas to set the stage for that for us. So welcome, and welcome to you from Denmark. That's exciting.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leslie.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So let's start off with a general question. The pandemic has raised, many people's awareness of the desirability for clean energy. Certainly, we saw that trend prior to the pandemic, but it seems to have accelerated. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I guess at least in many parts of the world during the pandemic, lots of people stayed home, and this meant that traffic was a lot less, and our pollution was a lot less. And for the general public, for the public discourse in many societies, this was kind of an eye-opener. We'd always talked about how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how can we make the world a greener place, and all of a sudden, COVID-19 caused all of that to happen right in front of our eyes. All the measurements of all these dirty pollutants certainly looked a lot better. And I guess on the public discourse, again, this meant that a lot of people became even more aware of the fact that we're fighting an invisible enemy in the coronavirus, and the pollution is a very visible enemy for a lot of us in the societies where we live. So this has become sort of a bigger battle than Corona for many people as they've stayed home. And there are not that many large renewable energy sources at this time. Solar is a big energy source, and logistically it's fairly easy to transport and store and install because the solar panels are very homogeneous and they can easily be moved. Solar does have an issue in terms of how it's being produced and if the production itself is sustainable or not. Wind is the other really big new renewable energy form, and the US, China, Germany, and some other countries, India, Spain, have a lot of wind turbines already onshore on land. And the new frontier is really offshore wind, putting turbines into the water. Besides solar and wind, the more conventional renewable sources are hydropower. So, for example, the Hoover Dam or some of those types of energy plants. But wind and solar are really the big sectors. So, for wind, this Corona pandemic has really sort of increased the awareness, and governments around the world are going at wind energy as hard as they ever had.
Yeah, and we hope that certainly that will continue. As I talk to people throughout the industry about the last, say, 9 months, wind projects seem to be one of the few, if only, types of projects where these, and they're huge components, obviously, but these things are still moving. So how is it that wind projects maybe weren't on the chopping block, or why are they still moving in what appears to be fairly large quantities?
Yeah, so I think that wind is still an energy form which is not necessarily fully regulated by supply and demand. It is still an energy form that in some countries requires a bit of tax breaks or tax subsidies or government subsidies. So it is not really a market-driven energy form, because this desire to create a cleaner world is still something that governments are driving. Now, inside the wind market, it's very much a dynamic market where we have supply and demand as we do in any other markets. But when we deal with governments, this can be at a federal level or national level. It can also be at a state level or county or regional level. And it can also be at a municipal level. And when we deal with governments, we often have very strict deadlines and milestones within projects. And we often see a planning span that is much longer than just 1, 2, 3 years, as we do with other projects. So these types of projects are increasing in velocity over the coming years, and it's not stopping just because of some kind of disruption to companies. It is continuous. The momentum is continuous, and in fact, we're seeing a bit of a increase in velocity now, as many governments are kind of saying, what should we do to get businesses moving again after Corona? So this week we saw Boris Johnson in the UK say that, they need to kind of move to larger targets for wind energy in the UK than what has been their plan so far. And they very much see renewables as a way to kind of get out of the doom and gloom that Corona leaves behind.
Right, it almost sounds like a stimulus measure, perhaps.
Yeah, so the EU has said that it will focus its stimulus measures on 2 main directions, one being digitalization and one being renewables. So for kind of a 80% stimulus, those 2 will kind of share equally half of that, and then they'll do some other little bits and bobs. But in many countries, they certainly see this energy transition, this transformation to a green economy, as being one of the ways to kind of say that society needs to rethink itself coming out of a big sort of crisis like this, and a big stop in kind of how we've been doing things.
Absolutely. So I think, you've identified another silver lining, that this is an opportunity to accelerate the green transformation, and perhaps on a larger global basis than might have been possible before. Perhaps. All right. So how about relative pricing? I have read recently that wind energy has the price to build such a project has come down, and is maybe, at least the gap, it has been narrow between that and, say, a conventional power plant. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so there are different ways that you can kind of compare energy forms when it comes to cost. Or one way is to say, do we need tax subsidies or not? And the first offshore wind farms that will be constructed globally without tax subsidies will come online to the grid in 2022 and 2023 in Holland and Germany. And this has in itself been a huge wake-up call for many governments around the world. And in fact, many governments have kind of said, wow, if it's free for me as a government, give it to me now. I want it today, right? But what has also got something to do with it is the supply chain. And in Europe, there's a built-out supply chain, both when it comes to the turbines, but also when it comes to everything else that needs to go in the water to mount the turbines on and to, make the power come back into shore and hit the grid. So you can't just get a no tax subsidized offshore wind industry in India or in Taiwan or in China or in the US for that matter, or in Brazil, just because you can see that it's being done in Holland or in Germany. It takes some years to build the supply chain. So that's one way of sort of saying, hey, I don't have to pay any tax breaks anymore. The other way of looking at it is to look at what's called levelized cost of energy. And that's really a sort of complex math formula that says over the lifespan of an energy plant, it will generate so and so much energy that can be sold. And the cost to construct the plant and run the plant and break the plant back down. So again, think of the Hoover Dam, for example. We put in all that concrete, we run the dam for so and so many years, and if I were you, I wouldn't walk under it at this point. I think it needs to be demolished pretty soon. But
well, it's very close to me, so yes.
Yeah, I know. So I'm like, don't go there. But so the total cost of building it, running it for all these years, and taking it back down once it needs to be taken back down is then weighed against the energy production. And this gives you a kind of levelized cost of energy. And this you can compare across, for example, geothermal, which was the energy form that escaped me earlier, or solar or wind or hydro or oil or gas or nuclear. And in fact, like you said, wind onshore and wind offshore has been become cheaper to produce the turbines and to run and maintain the turbines, so that a number of countries are actually seeing at this point that it is cheaper from a levelized cost of energy perspective to run wind energy than it is to run several of the more traditional, more darker, oil, gas, nuclear, whatnot. So that's kind of good news for these industries, that innovation is kind of continuously on the program.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's turn our attention to the Americas. What potential for offshore wind do you see in the U.S. and then down through Latin America? I'd like to cover both areas. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the U.S. has talked about offshore wind for a long time. And in 2018, we saw the first 5 test turbines go up, and we've just seen 2 more go up this year. So now, in a country with 330 million people, we now have 7 turbines, right? So, I mean, it's very much a kind of hurry up and wait situation where you've got many governors from many states that have a lot of ambitions on behalf of this public discourse again within their populations. And then you kind of have a federal situation where offshore wind sites are controlled. So the land mass is controlled by a federal body, and the federal system in the US does not have a offshore wind target or an offshore wind ambition. I think the current administration can certainly see that it's great to basically take an area, take a state, and then take a lot of the the water potential areas, the zones, and kind of auction them off and make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And then after you've done the auction, then you make a bid and you say, okay, now all of you who won the auctions can now bid for a small part of whatever the state needs from an offshore wind perspective. So after you've auctioned it and gotten a lot of cash, then you put a bid out, and only some of the folks who won the auction can then actually get to produce something. And that's only if you can get the federal permits in place for you to get going. So we got this kind of wait and see game at the moment where we move one step ahead and we take 3 steps backwards, which is a bit unfortunate because the industry as such, once it's invited in, it also expects that, when it makes its decisions, these are typically very private companies. And once they make financial investment decisions or they decide to move projects forward, they also hope that, the countries where they move in, that they will honor the commitments that they give. Right now, the big projects in the U.S. are on the East Coast, and for the most part, they are 1, 2, 3 years delayed, which is, of course, a lot of money when you start mobilizing a supply chain, people, infrastructure, vessels, ports, whatnot. So it does make the situation a bit, you need to have ice in your stomach at the moment. When we look at the West Coast, we have a different situation. We have more of a study situation where analysis is being carried out because the U.S. West Coast and Hawaii really are more suitable areas for floating turbines. So what we need to do on the U.S. West Coast is to put turbines out in the water that can float, because we can't connect the offshore wind turbines to the seabed. On the U.S. East Coast, along the 9 states there that have offshore wind ambitions, we can fix the turbines to a seabed foundation. And that technology is fairly mature. It is it's not, it's only been around for 30 years, but it's gotten to a much better. So it's not like a car. Henry Ford invented the car 100 plus years ago. It's a very mature industry. But when we fix turbines into the seabed, this is a fairly proven concept, primarily from Europe. So it's very feasible. And I think the floating offshore wind business is still very embryonic. It's at its infancy stage, and it's not expected that it will reach a cost level that's remotely competitive until sort of 2025 to 2030.
Okay.
So it's still sort of early days for that. So two very different markets, like East Coast US and West Coast US. So
now, where would the Gulf fall into that?
Well, the Gulf has had several projects, and in fact, you could say that if only the U.S. had started there, but I think that at the time when the plans for the Gulf were the most advanced, you also had to consider things like hurricanes and other things, and the wind technology was maybe not yet at a stage where it was safe enough to put up turbines in the water. And since that time, I think states like Texas have kind of pulled back a bit on their offshore wind plans. But it would have been maybe the best place to actually do something bigger size-wise, because you do have the port infrastructure that receives a lot of turbine parts already. Mm-hmm. You do have the oil industry in the U.S.-Mexican Gulf with lots of heavy lift capacity for offshore wind. So we wouldn't have to kind of create new ports and create new infrastructure and move all these cranes and heavy lift vessels around to the East Coast or to the West Coast. We kind of have it all there. So had we started, in the Gulf, I think we could have had maybe some larger, running projects at this point. But it looks like, we'll kind of start in the Northeast, and then we'll move down towards, Virginia, and the U.S. West Coast will come up with some demo sites for floating, just like we see right now in other demonstration areas like Japan and France and Scotland and Norway. So I think the U.S. will join kind of the leading edge of floating on the U.S. West Coast and Hawaii. And I think on the East Coast, we'll see the first bottom fixed offshore wind farms come up in the next couple of years.